Leonardo strode briskly down the bustling city street, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement. The rain had just stopped, leaving a sheen of water that reflected the kaleidoscope of city lights. Despite the late hour, the streets buzzed with life, a mix of hurried commuters, street vendors, and children laughing as they played. He barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind of corporate mergers and high-stakes decisions, the only life he'd known for years. As he approached an intersection, a burst of laughter cut through the city's noise. His gaze flickered toward the source. 4 children darting through puddles, their laughter brightening the dreary night. For reasons he couldn't explain, he stopped. The sight was ordinary, yet something gnawed at his subconscious. The children were young, no older than 7, their faces eerily familiar. One boy splashed into a puddle and turned toward Leonardo, locking eyes with him. The child froze, his grin fading into a look of surprise. Leonardo's heart skipped. It was like staring at a reflection of his own childhood self, down to the sharp jawline and the unruly mop of dark hair. He took a step forward, his breath caught in his throat, but the boy quickly turned, calling to the others in an excited whisper. "Hurry," the boy urged, motioning for his siblings. The group gathered and ran toward a narrow alley. Leonardo hesitated for a moment before his curiosity overwhelmed him, compelling him to follow. The children disappeared into the shadows, their laughter now faint echoes. The alley opened into a quieter street lined with modest houses. He saw the children enter a small, well-worn home with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. He stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, unsure what to do next. The scene before him was starkly different from the life he knew. This was no glimmering skyscraper or pristine penthouse. Yet the house exuded warmth, its windows glowing with soft light. His eyes lingered on the door that had just closed behind the children. Before he could decide whether to knock or leave, the door opened again. A woman stepped out, holding a basket of laundry. Leonardo's breath caught. Maria. She hadn't changed much in the 8 years since he'd last seen her. Her dark curls were shorter now, framing a face that was both tired and defiant. Her eyes, those deep, expressive eyes he could never forget, widened when they landed on him. The laundry basket slipped from her hands, clothes spilling onto the ground. "Leonardo?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. He took a hesitant step forward. "Maria, Words failed him as his gaze darted from her to the house, then back to her. Her expression shifted quickly from shock to something colder. She crossed her arms, blocking the doorway as if guarding it. "What are you doing here? I saw—" He started, gesturing toward the house. He struggled to find the right words. "I saw the children." Maria's jaw tightened. "And?" Leonardo stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They look like me." She stared at him for a long moment, then let out a bitter laugh. "So you noticed. Took you long enough." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The implications were staggering, impossible. "Maria, are you saying—" She cut him off, her voice sharp. "Yes, Leonardo, they're your children. All 4 of them." The world seemed to tilt. He felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. For years, he had buried thoughts of Maria, convincing himself it was for the best. Now, his past had returned with a force he couldn't ignore. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Maria's eyes flashed with anger. "Tell you? And what would you have done? Your family made it clear they wanted nothing to do with me, and you didn't fight them. You chose them, Leonardo. You left me." He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. The weight of her accusation hung heavy in the air. She stepped back, her voice softer but no less firm. "Go home, Leonardo. You don't belong here." With that, she shut the door, leaving him alone on the quiet street. For the first time in years, Leonardo felt truly lost. The laughter of the children still echoed in his ears, haunting him as he stood there, staring at the closed door of the life he never knew he had. The following morning, Leonardo sat in his expansive office, his gaze fixed on the sprawling skyline of towering glass and steel. Yet, The usual inspiration he drew from the view was absent. His mind was tethered to the modest house he'd stood before the previous night, to Maria and to the children she claimed were his. The revelation still echoed in his mind. 4 children. His children. The very thought unsettled him, dragging him into a tide of emotions he'd spent years suppressing. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. An incoming call from his father. For a moment, he considered answering, but the weight of his father's disapproval hung over him like a shadow. With a sigh, he silenced the phone and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't focus. The memory of Maria's face, her anger and pain, was vivid. And the children, their laughter, their resemblance to him. It was as though they'd taken up permanent residence in his thoughts. He couldn't ignore them. Not anymore. By midday, Leonardo had left the office, unable to shake his restlessness. Driving aimlessly through the city, he found himself retracing his steps to Maria's neighborhood. When his car came to a halt in front of her house, he hesitated. What was he even doing? He'd already been turned away. Yet, he couldn't leave. The pull was too strong. This time, he stepped out of the car, his resolve firm despite the uncertainty. Approaching the front door, he knocked twice and waited. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes before the door opened. Maria stood there, her expression hardening the moment she recognized him. "What do you want, Leonardo?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. "To talk," he said. "Please." She hesitated, her hand still gripping the door. Finally, she stepped aside, letting him in. The living room was modest but cozy, its walls adorned with children's drawings and shelves filled with books and toys. It was a world far removed from his own, yet it felt alive, vibrant in a way his sterile penthouse never had. Maria crossed her arms and leaned against the wall, her gaze wary. "Say what you need to say and leave." Leonardo took a deep breath, his words careful. "I didn't know about them. If I had—" Her eyes flashed, cutting him off. "If you had— What? What would you have done, Leonardo? Fought for us? For me?" "Because the man I knew back then didn't fight." He walked away. Her words stung, but he didn't flinch. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't fight, and I've regretted it every day since. But I'm here now, Maria. I want to make things right." Maria's expression softened, but only slightly. "And what does making things right mean to you? Do you think you can just walk in and be their father after all this time?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. Please, let me try." She sighed, her defenses still up but showing cracks. "They don't know who you are," she said quietly. "I've kept them safe from the pain of losing you before they even knew you. If you really want to be part of their lives, you'll have to prove it. Not to me, but to them." "How?" he asked, his voice steady despite the weight of her challenge. Maria straightened, her eyes meeting his. "That's for you to figure out, Leonardo. But know this, I won't let you hurt them. Not again." He nodded, her words sinking in. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, Leonardo knew this was only the beginning. To make things right, he would have to confront not just his past mistakes, but the man he'd become and the father he now needed to be. The morning light filtered through Leonardo's floor-to-ceiling windows, but it did little to brighten his mood. He sat motionless in his spacious living room, a steaming cup of coffee on the table untouched. The words Maria had spoken the night before replayed in his mind, each syllable cutting deeper. "You'll have to prove it." For the first time in years, he felt completely out of his depth. Corporate negotiations and business maneuvers were second nature to him. But this seeking forgiveness, building trust, was foreign territory. Yet, he knew he couldn't back away. Not now. After staring at his phone for what felt like an eternity, he finally dialed Maria's number. She picked up after a few rings, her voice guarded. "What is it, Leonardo?" "I'd like to see them," he said carefully. "The children, even if it's just for a short time." Silence stretched on the other end of the line. He imagined her weighing the risks, protecting the fragile world she built. "Tomorrow," she finally said, "at the park by our house. But don't expect more than an hour." "Thank you," he replied softly, but she had already hung up. The next afternoon, Leonardo arrived early at the small park Maria had mentioned. Dressed in casual clothes, his first time in years, he felt oddly out of place among the families and children playing freely. He scanned the area and spotted Maria sitting on a bench, her arms crossed as she kept a watchful eye on the 4 children playing soccer nearby. He approached hesitantly. Maria noticed him but didn't say a word, her expression unreadable. She nodded toward the children. "Go on." Leonardo's throat tightened as he took a step toward them. The oldest boy, Pedro, stopped mid-kick when he noticed Leonardo's approach. His expression hardened, his grip tightening on the soccer ball. The other children, Clara, Rafael, and little Júlia, turned to see what had caught their brother's attention. "Hi," Leonardo said, keeping his voice soft. "I'm Leonardo." Pedro's brow furrowed as he looked him over. "Who are you?" His tone was sharp, protective. Leonardo glanced briefly at Maria, who gave a barely perceptible nod, urging him to continue. Turning back to the children, he chose his words carefully. "I'm a friend of your mom's." The children exchanged uncertain glances. The youngest, Júlia, tilted her head, her curls bouncing as she studied him with wide eyes. "You don't look like her friend," she said bluntly, her honesty drawing a small smile from it. Clara stepped closer, her hands on her hips. "Are you rich? You dress like you're rich." Leonardo chuckled, kneeling down to meet their eye level. "I do okay," he admitted, "but I'm here to play soccer, not talk about money." Pedro remained skeptical, but when Rafael rolled the ball toward Leonardo, a silent truce seemed to form. "You can play," Rafael said simply, his voice hesitant but curious. For the next hour, Leonardo threw himself into the game. He ran, kicked, and laughed alongside the children, their energy infectious. Even Pedro, who kept a wary distance at first, couldn't resist the excitement of the game. Clara shouted instructions like a coach, while Júlia's giggles filled the air every time she managed to steal the ball from him. For a brief moment, Leonardo felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He didn't just see himself in the children. He felt a deep, undeniable connection to them. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Maria's voice called out from the bench. "Time to go." The children groaned in unison, their disappointment evident. Leonardo handed the ball back to Pedro, who accepted it without a word. "Thanks for letting me play," Leonardo said softly. Pedro shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, curiosity, maybe, or a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Júlia gave Leonardo a quick wave, while Clara studied him as if trying to figure out his intentions. Rafael smiled shyly before running to join his siblings. Maria waited as the children gathered their belongings. When Leonardo approached, she didn't speak right away, her gaze following the children as they bounded toward the car. Finally, she turned to him. "They had fun," she admitted, her tone neutral. "I did too," Leonardo said earnestly. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Maria's eyes softened slightly, but her guard remained firmly in place. "This doesn't change anything. If you want to be in their lives, you have a lot more to prove." Leonardo nodded, understanding the weight of her words. As he watched her leave with the children, he felt a mix of hope and determination. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt like he'd taken the first real step toward redemption. The next few days were a whirlwind for Leonardo. He spent his hours balancing his responsibilities at work with an emerging obsession, figuring out how to prove himself to Maria and the children. For someone used to solving problems with financial leverage and negotiation tactics, this challenge was uncharted territory. He thought back to his brief time at the park. Pedro's wary gaze, Clara's pointed questions, Rafael's shy smile, and Júlia's uninhibited laughter. They were so different, yet each reflected pieces of himself and Maria. Winning their trust would require patience and humility, virtues he wasn't sure he possessed but was determined to learn. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Leonardo found himself driving back toward Maria's neighborhood. He wasn't entirely sure what he hoped to achieve. He didn't want to intrude again, but being near them felt oddly comforting. As he drove past a small grocery store, he spotted Maria walking out, carrying a bag of groceries. Without thinking, he pulled into the parking lot and stepped out of the car. "Maria," he called, jogging to catch up with her. She turned, surprise flashing in her eyes before her expression settled into guarded neutrality. "What are you doing here?" "I was just passing through," he lied, though the truth was written all over his face. "Do you need a hand with those?" Maria glanced at the bag in her arms, then back at him. "I can manage." "Please," he insisted, extending his hand. "Let me help." She hesitated before handing over the bag, though her posture remained stiff. "Fine, just this once." As they walked toward her house, Leonardo tried to ease the tension. "The kids were great at soccer the other day," he said. "Julia's got some serious footwork." Maria's lips twitched as if she wanted to smile but refused to let herself. "She's got a lot of energy, that's for sure. Clara keeps her in check most of the time." "And Pedro?" Leonardo ventured. "He seems, protective." "He has to be," Maria said simply. "He's the oldest. They look up to him." Leonardo nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. Pedro wasn't just protective. He was filling a role Leonardo should have been there to take on. The realization stung more than he expected. When they arrived at the house, Maria unlocked the door and gestured for Leonardo to place the bag on the kitchen counter. The home was as warm and inviting as he remembered, with the faint scent of lavender and the sounds of cartoons playing in the living room. "Mom, you're back!" Clara's voice rang out as she appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing when she saw Leonardo. "Why's he here?" "Relax, Clara," Maria said gently. "He just helped with the groceries." Rafael peeked out from behind his sister, his curious gaze fixed on Leonardo. "Are you staying for dinner?" Maria started to protest, but Leonardo cut her off. "Only if it's okay with your mom." All eyes turned to Maria, who sighed in resignation. "Fine, but don't expect a feast. It's just spaghetti." The meal was simple but comforting, and Leonardo found himself at the table with the children for the first time. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Júlia chattered non-stop about her day at school, while Clara corrected her every exaggeration. Rafael quietly observed, occasionally chiming in with a shy comment, and Pedro mostly ignored him, focusing on his plate. Leonardo made an effort to engage without overstepping. He asked about their interests, their favorite subjects in school, and their favorite games. Slowly, the tension began to ease. Even Pedro cracked a smile when Júlia recounted a funny story about her teacher tripping over a stray soccer ball. After dinner, Maria sent the children to get ready for bed, leaving her alone with Leonardo in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That went better than I expected. They're incredible," he said earnestly. "You've done an amazing job with them." Maria's expression softened, but her guard didn't drop entirely. "They're my world. I won't let anything jeopardize that." "I know," Leonardo replied, "and I'm not here to take that away. I want to be part of it, if you'll let me." Maria studied him for a long moment before sighing. "We'll see." As Leonardo left the house that night, he felt a cautious optimism growing within him. It was just one dinner, one small moment, but it was a step forward. For the first time, he believed that earning Maria's trust and a place in the children's lives was truly possible. Leonardo arrived at his office the following morning, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Despite the flicker of progress he'd made with Maria and the children, he couldn't ignore the looming shadow of his father. Every step he took toward reconciling with his family threatened to shatter the delicate balance he had maintained for years in the corporate world. That afternoon, his father called. Leonardo stared at the buzzing phone for a long moment before finally picking up. "Hello?" "Leonardo." His father's voice was sharp, clipped, and unmistakably disapproving. "I've heard rumors." Leonardo exhaled, already knowing where the conversation was headed. "What rumors?" "That you've been spending time in less than ideal company. Something about a woman from your past and children." His father's voice dripped with disdain. Is it true? Leonardo's grip on the phone tightened. Yes, it's true. Silence hung heavy for a beat before his father spoke again, his tone cold. Do you understand what this could mean for us? For the company? For us? Leonardo snapped, unable to contain his frustration. You mean for you. This isn't about the company, and it's certainly not about me. It's about your obsession with control. Watch your tone, his father barked. You owe your position, your life, to this family. Don't forget that. Leonardo's jaw clenched. No, what I owe is to my children, the ones you kept from me. His father's silence this time was different, charged with anger and a hint of surprise. You don't know what you're doing, Leonardo. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences. Then let there be, Leonardo said, his voice steady. I'm done letting you dictate my life. He ended the call before his father could respond, his chest heaving with the weight of the confrontation. For the first time, he felt truly free, even if it came with the knowledge that his father would not let the matter rest. That evening, Leonardo found himself once again at Maria's door. She opened it with a mix of surprise and annoyance. You can't just show up whenever you feel like it, she said, crossing her arms. I needed to talk to you, he replied, his voice tinged with urgency. It's important. Maria sighed, but stepped aside to let him in. The children were in the living room, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Leonardo glanced toward them, a pang of warmth and longing hitting him before he turned back to Maria. I confronted my father today, he said without preamble. About you, about the kids. Maria's brows lifted in surprise, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. He threatened me, Leonardo admitted, his voice steady. Said there would be consequences if I kept seeing you, but I told him I didn't care. Maria's expression softened slightly, though her arms stayed crossed. And what happens now? Are you ready to give up everything just to be here? I've already lost so much by staying away, he said. I don't care about the consequences anymore. All I care about is making things right with you and the kids. Maria studied him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, she spoke. It's not just about confronting your father, Leonardo. It's about showing me and them that you're here for the long haul. I know, he said, and I'm not going anywhere. The next day, Pedro approached Maria while she was folding laundry. Mom, he began hesitantly. Why is he here? Maria set the shirt she was folding on the table and turned to her son. He's trying to make up for the time he missed. Pedro's brow furrowed. But why did he leave in the first place? If he cared, why wasn't he here? Maria crouched to meet his gaze, her voice gentle but firm. Sometimes adults make mistakes, big ones. But what matters is whether they're willing to fix them. Pedro frowned, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded and walked away, his shoulders tense. Maria watched him go, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Leonardo's road to redemption wouldn't be easy, not just with her, but with their children too. Later that week, Leonardo joined the family for another dinner. This time, the children were less guarded. Clara bombarded him with questions about his work, while Júlia giggled as she tried to guess his favorite color. Even Pedro, though still reserved, listened intently as Leonardo shared a story about his childhood. Maria observed quietly, her heart torn between caution and hope. She wanted to believe Leonardo's intentions were genuine, but years of pain and betrayal couldn't be erased in a few dinners. Still, as she watched him laugh with the children, she couldn't help but wonder if, just maybe, they were beginning to heal. The steady hum of the kitchen fan was the only sound between Maria and Leonardo as they worked side by side. The children's laughter drifted faintly from the living room, their voices rising and falling as they played a board game. Maria was at the stove, stirring a pot of hearty stew, while Leonardo stood at the counter, meticulously chopping vegetables under her instructions. You're chopping too slowly, Maria said without looking up, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. I'm trying to make them perfect, Leonardo replied, raising a carrot piece for her inspection. Small enough for Júlia? Maria cast him a sidelong glance. Close enough. She still finds something to complain about. Leonardo chuckled, shaking his head as he resumed chopping. Though their interactions were laced with Maria's characteristic dry humor, he couldn't help but notice the slight shift in her demeanor. She was less defensive, more willing to engage. The barriers she had built over the years seemed to be cracking, if only slightly. When the stew was ready, Maria called the children to the table. Clara arrived first, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the pot. "Did you put mushrooms in this?" Maria sighed. "No mushrooms. Now sit." Júlia bounded in next, climbing into her chair with uncontainable energy. "Smells good," she exclaimed, only to wrinkle her nose when she spotted a carrot. "Ooh, not those. You need your vegetables," Leonardo said, his tone teasing. "Besides, I chopped them just for you." Júlia pouted, but a small smile broke through. "Fine, but only because you did it." Pedro and Rafael arrived last, Pedro taking his usual spot at the head of the table like an unspoken family leader. He didn't say much, his eyes occasionally flicking to Leonardo, watching him with a mix of curiosity and guardedness. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Clara dominated the discussion, talking about a school project, while Rafael shyly added details here and there. Júlia was a whirlwind of stories, gesturing wildly as she recounted a playground adventure. Even Pedro contributed, though his remarks were brief and often aimed at correcting Clara's exaggerations. Leonardo listened intently, chiming in only when asked. He felt the warmth of the moment, the easy camaraderie he had never experienced before. It wasn't perfect. Pedro's wariness still lingered, and Clara's questions often felt like subtle tests, but it was a start. After dinner, Maria began clearing the table, but Leonardo stopped her. "Let me help." Maria arched an eyebrow but handed him a dish towel. "You dry." They worked in silence for a while, the clinking of plates and the running water filling the kitchen. Finally, Leonardo spoke. "Thank you for letting me be here tonight. It means more to me than you know." Maria paused, glancing at him. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice softened. "You're doing better than I thought you would." "I'm trying," he said simply. "I know it's going to take time, but I'm not giving up." Maria didn't respond immediately, returning to the dishes. "We'll see," she said quietly, her tone neither dismissive nor encouraging. The next day, Leonardo arrived early for an outing he had planned with the children. Maria had agreed, though not without hesitation. It would be the first time he would take them somewhere alone, a milestone he didn't take lightly. Pedro was the first to meet him at the door, arms crossed. "Do you even know how to take care of us?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Leonardo crouched slightly, meeting his eldest son's eyes. "I'm still learning," he admitted, "but I promise I'll do my best. Think you can help me out?" Pedro studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay, but if Júlia gets hurt, it's on you," Leonardo chuckled. Fair enough. The trip to the park was a success. The children raced across the open field, their laughter filling the air as they chased a soccer ball Leonardo had brought. Clara and Rafael argued over who had scored more goals, while Pedro played goalie with surprising focus. Júlia, as usual, darted between them, her energy boundless. After soccer, they stopped for ice cream at a small cart by the pond. Leonardo watched as the children chose their flavors, noting the way Rafael shyly asked for chocolate and the way Clara negotiated for an extra topping. Pedro opted for plain vanilla, his reserved nature showing even in his choice. "Do you like it?" Leonardo asked Júlia as she licked at her rapidly melting cone. She nodded enthusiastically, her face smeared with strawberry ice cream. "It's the best!" For a moment, Leonardo allowed himself to relax, to savor the simple joy of being with them. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so at peace. When they returned to the house, the children were exhausted but happy. Maria met them at the door, her arms crossed but her expression softening as she took in their glowing faces. "Did you behave?" she asked. "They were great," Leonardo said, smiling. "We had a lot of fun." Clara immediately launched into a detailed recount of the day, with Rafael and Júlia chiming in. Even Pedro offered a rare comment, though he quickly retreated to his room once the excitement died down. Maria turned to Leonardo as the children disappeared into the house. "They had fun," she said, her tone neutral. "So did I," he replied. "Thank you for trusting me with them." Maria studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You're starting to earn it. But don't think for a second that I'm letting my guard down," Leonardo smiled. "Wouldn't expect anything less." As he left the house, a small flicker of hope lit within him. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time, he believed it was one he could navigate. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Maria's home, casting a warm glow over the modest living room. Leonardo stood just inside the doorway, watching the children bustle about with their usual energy. Today was a big day. He had offered to take them to a local science museum, an outing he hoped would strengthen the fragile bond he was building with them. "Where's my other shoe?" Júlia shouted, her curls bouncing as she scurried around the room. "Mom, I can't find it." Maria appeared from the kitchen, a dish towel slung over her shoulder. "It's by the door where you left it," she said without looking up, her voice calm and knowing. Júlia darted to the door, triumphant as she grabbed the missing sneaker. Rafael tugged at Maria's sleeve, holding up a backpack that looked far too heavy for him. "Do I need all these books, Mom?" Maria crouched down, adjusting the straps on his bag. "No books today, just snacks and water. Leave the rest." Leonardo watched the scene unfold, a pang of admiration rising within him. Maria moved through the chaos with practiced ease, her patience and love evident in every word and gesture. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I think we're ready." Maria glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've got everything? Tickets, money for lunch? And remember, Rafael gets carsick if he sits in the back." Leonardo nodded, holding up a neatly folded itinerary he had prepared. "Got it all under control." Maria raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stepping aside to let the children out the door. As Leonardo followed them, she called out, "Don't be late coming back." The drive to the museum was filled with chatter. Clara quizzed Leonardo about his favorite exhibits, while Júlia peppered him with questions about everything from dinosaurs to space travel. Rafael quietly watched the passing scenery, while Pedro, seated in the front passenger seat, offered the occasional sarcastic remark. "You're trying too hard," Pedro said, as Leonardo explained the museum's dinosaur exhibit. Leonardo grinned. "Maybe, but isn't that better than not trying at all?" Pedro didn't respond, but the faint smirk on his face felt like a small victory. At the museum, the children's excitement was palpable. Clara darted toward the space exploration exhibit, dragging Rafael along with her, while Júlia ran straight to the life-size dinosaur models. Leonardo stayed close, marveling at their curiosity and enthusiasm. Even Pedro, who had initially hung back, seemed captivated by the hands-on science displays. Leonardo made an effort to engage with each of them. He helped Clara and Rafael build a model rocket, cheered Júlia on as she bravely stepped into a simulated earthquake chamber, and challenged Pedro to a trivia game in the technology exhibit. Slowly, he felt the invisible walls between them beginning to crumble. By lunchtime, they were seated at a small cafe inside the museum, their table crowded with sandwiches, chips, and juice boxes. Júlia chatted animatedly about the dinosaurs, while Rafael carefully arranged his food into neat rows before eating. Clara asked Leonardo a dozen rapid-fire questions about his childhood, her curiosity unrelenting. "Did you like museums when you were a kid?" she asked. "I did," Leonardo replied, smiling, "but I didn't go to many. My father didn't have much patience for them." Clara frowned. "Why not?" Leonardo hesitated, unsure how much to share. He was busy with work. He thought other things were more important. Pedro, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Didn't you think it was important?" Leonardo met his son's gaze, the weight of the question sinking in. "I didn't know better back then, but now I do. That's why I'm here with you." Pedro looked away, but his expression softened. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Leonardo hope. As the day wound down, The children were visibly tired but content. On the drive back, Júlia fell asleep, her head resting on Clara's shoulder, while Rafael dozed off, clutching a small stuffed dinosaur he had bought at the gift shop. Pedro remained awake, staring out the window with a thoughtful expression. When they arrived home, Maria was waiting at the door. The children tumbled out of the car, each of them eager to share stories of their day. Clara launched into a detailed account of the rocket-building activity, while Júlia waved her dinosaur proudly in the air. Maria listened with a mix of amusement and relief. As the children filed inside, she turned to Leonardo. "They seem happy." "They are," he said. "It was a good day." Maria nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for taking them." Leonardo hesitated before speaking. "Maria, I know this doesn't fix everything, but I want you to know I'm serious about being here. For them. For you." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "We'll see," she said finally, her tone cautious but less guarded than before. As Leonardo walked back to his car, he felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but days like this made him believe that, step by step, he could rebuild the family he had lost. The following week, Leonardo found himself back at Maria's house, seated at the small dining table with the children scattered around him. It had become an unspoken tradition for him to join them for dinner once or twice a week. Tonight's meal was lasagna, a family favorite that Clara proudly declared to be the best thing her mom cooked. "Don't burn it this time, Mom," Clara teased as Maria pulled the dish from the oven. Maria shot her a mock glare. "One time, Clara. It happened one time." Leonardo chuckled, leaning forward to help Júlia set the table. She handed him a mismatched collection of forks and knives, her small hands struggling to carry them all. "You're getting better at this," she said matter-of-factly, her face serious as she watched him arrange the silverware. "Better at what?" he asked. "At being here. At not being." "Weird," she replied, giggling at her own bluntness. Leonardo smiled, a warmth spreading through him at her honesty. "I'll take that as a compliment." The meal was lively as always. Clara and Pedro bickered over a school project, while Rafael shared details about his upcoming soccer game. Júlia, ever the entertainer, recounted a dramatic story about a frog she claimed had followed her home from the park. Through it all, Leonardo felt a growing sense of belonging. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of the conversation, part of the family, even if the bonds were still fragile in some places. After dinner, as the children settled into their evening routines, Maria motioned for Leonardo to join her in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms as she watched him rinse plates at the sink. "You're fitting in better than I thought you would," she admitted, her tone neutral. Leonardo looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." Maria hesitated before speaking again. "The kids, they're starting to trust you. But Pedro, he's still holding back. He's always been the cautious one." Leonardo nodded, drying his hands on a towel. "I've noticed. I don't blame him. I haven't exactly earned his trust yet." Maria studied him for a moment, her gaze softer than usual. "You're trying. That's more than I expected." Later that week, Leonardo decided to focus on Pedro. The boy's guarded nature reminded him of his own childhood, always watching, always wary, afraid to let his guard down. He wanted to show Pedro that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was committed to being there for him. On Friday afternoon, Leonardo arrived at Maria's house with 2 tickets in hand. Pedro was in the yard, kicking a soccer ball against the fence, his movements precise and controlled. "Hey, Pedro," Leonardo called out, walking toward him. Pedro stopped, wiping sweat from his brow. "What?" Leonardo held up the tickets. "I thought we could go to the game tomorrow. Just the 2 of us. What do you think?" Pedro eyed him suspiciously. "Why?" "Because I want to spend time with you," Leonardo said honestly. "And because I heard you're a pretty great soccer player. I thought you might like to see the professionals in action." Pedro hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I don't know." "No pressure," Leonardo added quickly. "But if you change your mind, I'll pick you up at noon." The next day, Leonardo's car was parked outside the house promptly at noon. For a moment, he wondered if Pedro would come. Then the front door opened, and the boy stepped out, a soccer jersey draped over his small frame. "I'm ready," Pedro said simply, climbing into the car. Leonardo smiled, relief washing over him. "You're going to love this." At the stadium, Pedro's initial reluctance faded as the game began. He leaned forward in his seat, his eyes glued to the field as the players moved with precision and speed. Leonardo marveled at how animated Pedro became, shouting out plays and cheering loudly when his favorite team scored. "Did you see that pass?" Pedro exclaimed during halftime, his excitement contagious. "I could do that. I just need more practice." Leonardo grinned. "I bet you could. Maybe we can practice together sometime." Pedro's enthusiasm dimmed slightly as he looked at Leonardo. "You mean that?" "I do," Leonardo said firmly. "I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Pedro didn't respond immediately, but when the second half started, he leaned closer to Leonardo, sharing commentary and predictions about the players. It was a small gesture, but to Leonardo, it felt like a breakthrough. When they returned home that evening, Pedro ran inside to tell his siblings about the game. Maria stepped onto the porch, her arms crossed but her expression curious. "How'd it go?" she asked. Leonardo smiled. "Better than I expected." "He's an incredible kid, Maria." She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I know." As Leonardo walked to his car, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Each step forward was hard-won, but it was worth every effort. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just visiting their lives. He was becoming part of them. The following week, Maria was up early, finishing her coffee as she glanced at the calendar on the wall. It was the day of Rafael's soccer game, an event that had become a highlight for the entire family. Clara was rummaging through a drawer for her scarf. Júlia was already tying her sneakers, and Pedro sat at the table, reviewing a playbook he'd drawn up for his younger brother. Maria turned as Leonardo knocked softly on the open door. "Morning," he said, stepping inside. He carried a thermos and a bag of snacks. "You're prepared," Maria remarked, raising an eyebrow. "First soccer game as part of the family," he said with a smile. "I didn't want to mess it up." Maria didn't respond, but her lips twitched in a faint smile as she handed Rafael his cleats. "Go get your gear on," she told him. "We leave in 10 minutes. The soccer field was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Parents lined the sidelines, cheering as the teams warmed up. Rafael darted toward his teammates, his face glowing with excitement. Leonardo set up a folding chair next to Maria, glancing around as Júlia tugged on his sleeve. "You have to cheer loud," she instructed. "Rafael gets nervous if it's too quiet." "Loud cheering got it," he replied, earning a satisfied nod from her. The game began with Rafael's team quickly taking possession of the ball. Rafael moved nimbly across the field, his focus unshakable. Clara clapped enthusiastically, shouting encouragement, while Pedro leaned forward, analyzing every play. Leonardo couldn't help but be swept up in the energy of it all. When Rafael scored a goal in the second half, the family erupted in cheers. Júlia jumped up and down. Clara waved her scarf, and even Pedro allowed himself a triumphant shout. Maria, seated quietly beside Leonardo, clapped her hands slowly. "He's worked hard for this," she said, her voice filled with pride. "He's amazing," Leonardo agreed. "You've done a great job with all of them." Maria glanced at him, her expression softening. "They're tough." They had to be. Leonardo nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "And they have you to thank for that." After the game, Rafael ran to them, his face flushed and beaming. "Did you see my goal?" "We saw," Clara said, ruffling his hair. "You were awesome." "You were more than awesome," Leonardo added, crouching to meet Rafael's eyes. "You were unstoppable." Rafael's grin widened, and he turned to Pedro. "Did I do it right?" Pedro gave a rare, approving nod. "You did good, Rafa." The family lingered on the field as the teams packed up, chatting with other parents and enjoying the crisp afternoon air. Leonardo found himself carrying Júlia on his shoulders as she pointed out cloud shapes in the sky. Maria stood nearby, her arms crossed as she watched the scene. It was a simple moment, but one that felt monumental. For so long, she had shouldered the weight of raising the children alone. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the possibility of sharing that burden. That evening, back at Maria's house, the family gathered around the small living room for a movie night. Rafael sat proudly with his trophy. Clara and Júlia snuggled under a blanket. And Pedro sat on the floor with his arms crossed, though his attention was clearly on the screen. Leonardo sat on the edge of the couch, the warmth of the room settling over him. He glanced at Maria, who sat quietly on the other side, her focus on the children. Catching his gaze, she tilted her head slightly. "You're doing better," she said softly, her words almost lost beneath the movie's dialogue. "Thanks to you," he replied, his voice equally quiet. Maria didn't respond, but for the first time, there was no trace of skepticism in her expression. Instead, there was something that almost looked like trust. Later, as the children drifted off to bed, Leonardo stayed behind to help Maria clean up. They moved through the motions in companionable silence, clearing plates and folding blankets. Finally, Maria broke the quiet. "You've been showing up," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for me, but for them. They notice it, even if they don't always say it." Leonardo set a glass on the counter, meeting her gaze. "That's all I want, for them to know I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere." Maria nodded slowly. "It's not going to be easy. There are things you'll need to face. Things we'll both need to face." "I'm ready," he said firmly. Maria's lips pressed together in a faint smile. "We'll see." It was a cautious step forward, but as Leonardo left the house that night, he felt a quiet sense of hope. The journey wasn't over, but they were no longer walking it alone. The next few weeks passed in a blur of small but meaningful moments. Leonardo continued to carve out space in the lives of the children and Maria, each step bringing him closer to the family he had only recently discovered. He had begun to feel a rhythm, a fragile balance between his responsibilities at work and his growing presence in their world. But one evening, as Leonardo walked into Maria's house for dinner, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The usually lively home was quiet. Maria stood at the kitchen counter, her back to him, while Pedro sat at the table, his face clouded with anger. "What's going on?" Leonardo asked, setting his keys down carefully. Maria turned, her expression hard. "Pedro got into a fight at school." Leonardo's stomach dropped as he turned to the boy. "Is that true?" Pedro crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "It wasn't my fault." Maria shot him a sharp look. "The principal called. They said you punched another boy." Pedro looked away, his silence confirming the accusation. Leonardo took a seat across from him, his voice calm but firm. "Why did you do it?" The boy hesitated before muttering. "He said stuff about you, about us." Leonardo blinked, surprised. "What kind of stuff?" Pedro's hands balled into fists on the table. "That you didn't care about us. That you left because we weren't good enough." Maria's breath hitched, and she glanced at Leonardo, her expression conflicted. He leaned forward, his voice softening. "Pedro, listen to me. None of that is true. What I did leaving, not being here, was my fault. It was never about you. You and your siblings. You're more than good enough. You're everything." Pedro's shoulders sagged slightly, but the tension didn't leave his face. "And why did you leave?" Leonardo exhaled, feeling the weight of the question. "Because I made a mistake. I let other people decide what was best for me, and I didn't fight hard enough to stay. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Pedro looked at him, his eyes searching Leonardo's face for the truth. Finally, he gave a small nod, though his expression remained guarded. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Maria found Leonardo in the living room, staring out the window. She walked over and handed him a cup of tea. "Thank you," he said, his voice heavy. "For what?" Maria asked, sitting down beside him. "For letting me handle that with Pedro," he replied. "He has every right to be angry with me. They all do." Maria nodded, her hands wrapped around her mug. He's a lot like you. Stubborn, proud. He's going to test you, push you, but it's not because he doesn't want you here. It's because he's scared you'll leave again. Leonardo turned to her, his voice steady. I won't, not ever. Maria held his gaze for a long moment before looking away. I hope that's true, for their sake. The next day, Leonardo took Pedro out for a quiet afternoon, just the two of them. They didn't talk about the fight or what had been said at school. Instead, they went to a local hardware store and picked up supplies for a small project. Birdhouse Pedro had wanted to build for weeks. As they worked together in Maria's yard, Leonardo noticed Pedro's guarded demeanor start to ease. The boy asked for his advice on cutting the wood, even letting him help paint the finished product. By the time the birdhouse was done, Pedro seemed lighter, his earlier anger replaced with a quiet sense of accomplishment. This looks great, Leonardo said, holding up the finished product. You did most of the work. Pedro shrugged but couldn't hide his smile. It's okay, I guess. It's more than okay, Leonardo replied. It's perfect. Pedro looked at him, the faintest hint of a grin on his face. Thanks. Later that evening, Maria noticed the birdhouse on the porch as she returned from the grocery store. She paused, running her fingers over the freshly painted wood. Pedro made it, Leonardo said from the doorway, his voice soft. He did an amazing job. Maria glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You're getting through to him. I hope so, he replied. He deserves to feel safe, to know I'm here for him. Maria nodded, her gaze shifting back to the birdhouse. We all do. Leonardo stepped closer, his voice gentle. I'm here, Maria. I know it's hard to believe after everything, but I am. Maria didn't respond immediately, but when she looked at him, her eyes held something he hadn't seen before, an inkling of trust. We'll see. For the first time, the words didn't feel like a wall but a door, one he was determined to open fully. The early morning light filtered through the windows as Leonardo parked his car outside Maria's house. He had planned today carefully, hoping to create a moment that would bring the family closer together. He grabbed a box of supplies from the passenger seat and made his way to the door, knocking softly. Maria opened it, her hair still damp from a shower. She raised an eyebrow. What are you doing here this early? I thought we could do something together, Leonardo said, lifting the box for her to see. A family project. It's Saturday, after all. Maria crossed her arms but didn't turn him away. What kind of project? A garden, he said with a smile. I picked up seeds, tools, and everything we'll need. It'll be good for the kids and for us. Maria hesitated before stepping aside. You better not make a mess. An hour later, the entire family was in the backyard. Leonardo had laid out gloves, shovels, and seed packets, explaining his vision for a small vegetable garden along the fence line. Clara and Júlia jumped in enthusiastically, choosing which seeds they wanted to plant, while Rafael watched quietly, waiting for instructions. Pedro stood off to the side, arms crossed, a skeptical look on his face. You really think this is going to work? Only if we all pitch in, Leonardo replied, handing Pedro a small shovel. You can help me dig the trenches. Pedro eyed him for a moment before taking the shovel and kneeling beside him. Together, they worked in silence, the rhythm of their digging punctuated by the girls' chatter and Rafael's occasional questions. As the morning wore on, the backyard came alive with activity. Júlia giggled as she accidentally spilled a packet of seeds, while Clara lectured her on proper planting techniques. Rafael carefully placed his seeds in neat rows, his concentration unwavering. Even Pedro began to loosen up, offering suggestions on where to plant the tomato vines. Maria watched from the porch, a faint smile playing on her lips. She held a cup of coffee in her hands, the sight of her children laughing and working together filling her with a bittersweet sense of hope. When Leonardo looked up and caught her eye, she nodded slightly, as if acknowledging his effort. By the time they finished, the garden was planted, its rows neatly marked with small wooden stakes and handwritten labels. The children stood back to admire their work, their faces glowing with pride. We'll have carrots and tomatoes and peppers, Júlia exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. And weeds, Pedro added, though his tone was more teasing than critical. Maria stepped off the porch, surveying the freshly turned soil. It looks good, she admitted. Let's see if you can keep it alive. Leonardo grinned. With a team like this, I think we'll manage. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the family gathered in the living room. Clara flipped through an old gardening book she'd found in Maria's collection, while Rafael sketched pictures of the plants they had sown. Pedro sat at the kitchen table, jotting down a list of chores for keeping the garden maintained, a task Leonardo had suggested, much to Pedro's quiet delight. Maria leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene unfold. When Leonardo approached, she glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've been good for them," she said softly. "They needed something like this." "So did I," Leonardo replied. "Being with them, with you. It's the first time in years I felt like I'm where I'm supposed to be." Maria hesitated, then nodded. "They're starting to trust you. I can see it. Even Pedro." "That means everything to me," Leonardo said. "But I know it's not just about them. I still need to earn your trust too." Maria's gaze met his, her eyes searching his face. "You're trying, and that matters. But trust. It takes time. I'll wait as long as it takes," he said earnestly. "I'm not going anywhere." Maria looked away, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "We'll see." That night, as Leonardo left the house, he paused to glance back at the garden they had planted together. It was a small patch of earth, but it felt like something much larger, a symbol of the life he was trying to build, one seed at a time. For the first time, he believed that with patience and care, it might grow into something beautiful. The garden flourished over the following weeks, its neat rows of vegetables a testament to the family's shared effort. Each day, the children raced to check on its progress, marveling at the tiny green shoots that pushed through the soil. Pedro took charge of watering. Clara kept track of the planting schedule. Rafael weeded meticulously, and Júlia enthusiastically reported every new sprout. Leonardo found himself more at home than he'd ever imagined. Dinner became a nightly ritual, filled with laughter and conversation. Even Pedro, once wary and distant, began seeking his advice, subtle, quiet gestures that spoke volumes. For Maria, the changes were both heartwarming and terrifying. She wanted to believe in this new version of Leonardo, but the scars of the past made it hard to let go of her doubt completely. One evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Clara looked at Leonardo with a mischievous glint in her eye. "So, when are you going to cook for us?" she asked. The table fell silent. Leonardo blinked, caught off guard. "Cook? Me?" "Yeah," Clara said, grinning. "You can't just chop vegetables. You've got to prove yourself in the kitchen." Júlia clapped her hands. "Yes. Can you make spaghetti? Or maybe pancakes?" Leonardo laughed nervously. "I'm not exactly a chef, but I can try." Maria smirked from the other end of the table. "Good luck. They'll hold you to it." The following Saturday, Leonardo arrived early, armed with groceries and a recipe book. Clara and Júlia hovered nearby, offering unsolicited advice as he prepped the ingredients for lasagna. Rafael helped grate cheese, while Pedro stood at the stove, watching him saute onions with a critical eye. "You're burning it," Pedro muttered. "I am not," Leonardo shot back, though he quickly turned down the heat. Maria leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, silently enjoying the chaos. It wasn't perfect flour dusted the counter, and a sauce spill threatened to drip onto the floor, but the kitchen buzzed with a sense of camaraderie she hadn't felt in years. When the lasagna finally emerged from the oven, golden and bubbling, the family gathered around the table. Clara took the first bite and declared it acceptable, which earned a round of laughter. Even Pedro smirked as he served himself a second helping. After dinner, the family moved to the living room, where they settled into their usual spots for a movie night. Leonardo sat between Clara and Júlia, who snuggled against his sides, their earlier teasing replaced with sleepy contentment. Rafael flipped through channels until he found a cartoon they all agreed on, while Pedro stretched out on the floor, his head propped on a pillow. Maria sat quietly, her gaze shifting from the screen to the family around her. The sight of Leonardo with the children, the way he laughed with them, the ease with which he had integrated into their lives, stirred something. It wasn't just trust she felt growing. It was the faint, cautious stirrings of hope. Later that evening, as the children headed off to bed, Maria found Leonardo tidying up the living room. She hesitated before speaking. "They're happy. I haven't seen them like this in a long time." Leonardo straightened, meeting her gaze. "That's all I want, for them to be happy. For us to be happy." Maria nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, but it hasn't been easy." "No, it hasn't," he agreed. "But it's been worth every moment." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You said once that you weren't going anywhere. I think I'm starting to believe you." Leonardo's breath caught, the weight of her words sinking in. "Maria, I know I can't change the past, but I want to build a future with you with them, whatever it takes." Maria looked at him for a long moment before giving a faint, hesitant smile. "We'll see," she said, the familiar phrase carrying a different meaning this time, a promise of possibility. The night was quiet as Leonardo stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his skin. He glanced back at the house, its warm light spilling through the windows. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was a home. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, like he had finally found his place. As he walked to his car, he thought of the garden they had planted together. It was thriving now, its rows of vegetables standing tall and proud. But Leonardo knew the real growth wasn't in the soil. It was in the bonds they had built, the trust they had nurtured, and the love that had quietly, steadily taken root. This was only the beginning. And for the first time, Leonardo was ready for whatever came next.